Again, I'm presenting financial toxicity and treatment decision making among people with multiple myeloma. Remind you, I started off after undergrad. I started working in research at WashU, got assigned to multiple myeloma, didn't know what the hell it was, to be honest. But as I got more familiar with the disease and started seeing different trends coming up, I got really interested in cancer disparities. And that really built me into the person I am today, but has really led my research agenda to push me back to going to not only my master's program, but now the PhD. So I owe a lot of what I've become to this experience that I've had. So between 2000 and 2016, about 100 new drugs were approved by the FDA. Now, each of these drugs come with a huge expense. About $650 million are spent to get a single drug approved. And although some of these drugs are very beneficial, on average, they only increase survival by about 2.5 months. And what I'll show you today is that we can make sizable gains just by making sure that the patients who already have, or patients get access to the drugs that we already have available today. Because there is huge inequities in treatment access among patients with cancer. And it can be seen in a number of different malignancies where, for example, multiple myeloma, which is what we're going to talk mostly today, if Black people just received the same care as their peers, their median overall survival would go up by 4 months. But despite these observations, comparatively little research is done in the way of improving access to care. And partially it's because we don't really know what the root mechanisms or the root causes of these disparities are. And the research to date that has been focused on trying to eliminate disparities because of that have been kind of ill-guided and not very beneficial. But what I'm going to show you today is how my research, I think, has identified one of the mechanisms of this disparity. Just some background on multiple myeloma. So multiple myeloma is an incurable blood cancer. It arises from plasma cells, which are part of the normal immune system. It is incurable, meaning the vast majority of patients who get it will die of the disease. But the treatment has advanced much over the past decade or so, where the average lifespan went from being 2 to 4 years to 4 to 6, and there's some patients now living decades with the disease, especially younger and fitter patients. But we find great inequities in treatment access for these patients. And so about a decade ago, this data started coming out, and the leading theory in the field was that African Americans or Black people with myeloma had a more advanced disease. So they get diagnosed at a younger age and they have poor outcomes. But that really just doesn't tend to bear out when we look at the data. So when you actually look at the data over time, which I've done here, so this is showing the median overall survival of an average patient, and these are adjusted for age and sex differences of Black patients and white patients over from 1970s through 2010. And what we can see is in the early 70s, Black patients actually had an innate advantage when it came to overall survival. And that kind of deteriorated over the next 2 decades. And then what we've seen more recently is that there's been an improvement, a vast improvement in outcomes among these patients, but that the slope has not been as robust for African Americans. So now when over the past decade or so, we've been identifying these disparities, well, these actually came out of the treatment advances that we had earlier on. So this is showing that these disparities that we're seeing in outcome really are man-made. When these new treatments came out in the 90s and the 2000s, since patients don't receive them in the same, in an equitable fashion, it turns out into these survival disadvantages. showing that data in a different way. So this is data from a study I did using SEER Medicare. So this is patients over the age of 65, and it's comparing median overall survival of patients who are white in the blue line versus black or African American in the green line. And what we can see is when we control for treatment, now black patients are now this orange line that basically is superfluous on the blue line. So if these patients, being black or African American, just get treated similarly to their peers, we would have no survival differences observed. Now, there's been a number of studies, including mine and other people's, that have looked at these access disparities, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just showing you kind of the breadth of the data, that virtually everywhere we look, black patients are just receiving less care than white patients with this disease. An interesting fact, though, is most of this seems to be mediated by socioeconomic status, though. It doesn't seem to be related to directly to race, but rather, again, socioeconomic status. So fundamentally, what we know of right now, our conceptual model of disparities in myeloma kind of looks like this. So race is associated with access disparities, but that's largely mediated by SES. Now there's some cases where that's not necessarily 100%, so there still is a direct relationship here. For example, stem cell transplants, even if you control for SES, African Americans just don't seem to get those as much as white people do. So there still is a direct relationship here, but largely it is mediated by socioeconomic status. And then these disparities, in turn, become outcome disparities at the population level. But again, so although we have this conceptual model, it's still not very clear what the mechanism of this is. So it's easy to say, well, low socioeconomic status. What does that really mean in practice? Does that mean that patients have inferior insurance and aren't coming to see the physicians at a certain center, which we've seen, but kind of disputing that is just being the raw mechanism is, we see these disparities even in single centers. So even at Simon Cancer Center, I've shown that patients who come through there who are African American or black get different treatment. And these are patients who have already overcome the barrier to get into a NCI designated cancer center. So they already are probably, they have better access to healthcare than the average population that doesn't necessarily come see a specialist like we are. So, like I said, it's very unclear how this process plays out. And I think one possible mechanism for this might be financial toxicity, which is what my research interest is in. So financial toxicity is kind of a buzzword. It's picked up over the past decade or so, but it's really just describing a phenomenon that physicians, providers have known about for decades, where as patients start receiving their care and start receiving bills, it creates stress. It leads to anxiety, maybe depression, and ultimately can lead to patients making trade-offs with their care. What we see is that patients who have financial toxicity are more likely to report deferring medication. They are less likely to, are more likely to cancel appointments. So they do things to try to alleviate some of that financial stress, and the way they do that is by getting less care. So the mechanism, I think, that this, in which socioeconomic status is influencing access is through financial toxicity, at least in part. So financial toxicity, there are many models. I like this one from Carrera and Zafar from 2018. In short, it says that financial toxicity is really made up by the objective financial burden, so you're getting these bills, but also the subjective financial distress. So it's not just the fact that you're getting the bills, because I get my wife just gave birth 2 months ago. I'm getting a ton of medical bills. They're not really very distressing to us, so it's not really leading to financial toxicity. But if it was, that could lead to financial toxicity. And there's different things that could mediate this, like what kind of wealth you have. You know, we are more affluent people, so obviously those bills are less burdensome to us than it might be to somebody who is less affluent. But most importantly, what we see from financial toxicity is it does potentially lead to non-adherence and worse outcomes. Again, suggesting that this could be a possible mechanism for disparities. And when we look at patients with financial toxicity, what we see is that many of them have to start doing something to offset the cost of their care. So the vast majority of patients have to cut back on things like leisure activities. They might not go to as many baseball games, maybe they don't go on as many vacations, but about half have to actually stop reducing spending on more necessities like food, clothing. About half the patients have to dip into their savings, but then there's about a quarter of patients that start exhibiting what we call non-adherence. So they stop filling prescriptions. Maybe they take less pills than they were supposed to, so they're told to take 2 pills a day, they take 1, or they take a half instead of 1. Maybe they partially fill a prescription, instead of getting a month's supply, they only get 2 weeks. So the data does show that a non-insignificant portion of patients go through these trade-offs as a way to try to balance the costs that they have coming in. And these trade-offs that patients make with their care is what we sometimes refer to as price sensitivity. And really that just means that patients are very conscious of the costs that they're facing and are making these trade-offs to try to reduce those costs. And as one patient told a study, researchers of a qualitative study, I can't pay that, I cannot. That's a third of our income. I can't do that, so I would do without my medicine. And this is unfortunately more common than we would like to believe, that patients have to make these trade-offs. Now, when people are making any kind of decisions, it usually involves some kind of trade-off, and that is also seen in cancer care. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Unfortunately, there is no perfect treatment, usually for any disease. A perfect treatment would be something you took once that maybe was a pill, had no side effects, cost a penny. That doesn't exist in the real world. There is no free lunch in nature, they say. So medicines have side effects. Medicines have other costs. So people are always trying to balance this. Whenever we make any decision, we're having to balance the pluses and the minuses. And patients do this all the time. Now, again, price sensitivity, which is what we're interested in, is when patients are doing this directly related to cost concerns. So, like I said, a patient who is trying to weigh, well, do I want this treatment that's a pill versus this treatment with less, that's a shot that's less side effects? Well, that's part of the normal decision making. Now it's, well, do I want this pill that is better versus this pill, but this one's cheaper? That's something that's not fundamentally healthy for our medical system in general. And what this research is really focused on is those trade-offs that are directly related to cost concerns. But this is really hard to study in real-world scenarios, just because of the complexity of healthcare decisions. So this here is a model of healthcare decision-making where it doesn't really talk about how people make decisions, but it's more of just, so patients come in with their own background and history, and so do physicians, and together they discuss the alternatives, and ultimately a treatment decision is made. And then, like I said, this is a fairly simple model, but you can see the complexity of all this. That if you're trying to observe this in real scenarios, it's hard to tell what patients are bringing in, what doctors are bringing in, what is actually recommended or talked about in the treatment visits. A lot of studies, including ones I've done, use the actual treatment somebody got as a proxy for a decision, which you could see would be flawed. For example, I did a qualitative study a few years back looking at patients who declined stem cell transplant, and more than one of them, when I called and asked about, if they want to participate in my study, said, I didn't decline the transplant. The doctor told me not to, or I didn't decline the transplant, some other reason. So you can see, like, using that as a whether or not somebody actually got a treatment as a proxy is not necessarily a good way of doing it. But because of this complexity, most research has been limited to using that to date. But newer studies using more sophisticated experimental designs, borrowed mostly from the field of economy or economics, like this, instead of looking at real-world treatment decisions, we do experiments where we give patients like hypothetical treatment scenarios, and we see what decisions they make in a vacuum. And not only is this more easily observable because we can choose, see if they're choosing treatment A versus treatment B in this scenario here, we can directly influence what information they get and how they receive that information and see how that influences their treatment decision. Versus in real world practices, that just would never happen. I could never influence what treatment, what information patients got in their clinical encounter to such a degree that I could say that I was able to influence their treatment decision. So this is an example of one such study that I did a few years ago, just published earlier this year, with the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, where we recruited about 100 patients with multiple myeloma, and we had them do these hypothetical treatment scenarios in what's called a discrete choice experiment. And based on their decisions, we could determine how important each of these factors were to the patients when they made their decision. And this is just an example of how some of that data works. This is all the normalized preference weights. And you can tell how important something is by basically how far the line goes. So the most important thing to patients here was nerve damage. And again, you can just tell from the absolute difference between the highest and lowest. But this study, again, was really just looking at preferences of patients. And while we hope to do sub-analysis looking at preferences based on race, one issue that comes into studies like this is low minority participation hindered that, and we weren't able to do that. So like I said, this is just for the population in general. But shows how we can use sophisticated experiments like this to study phenomenon such as price sensitivity. And I'll get into more of that here in just a moment. So the aims of this study was to compare price sensitivity among people with multiple myeloma and varying levels of financial toxicity. And then secondary, I wanted to look at financial toxicity and price sensitivity among people varying by race and socioeconomic status. So for this study, I did a cross-sectional survey. It was a custom REDCap survey that I built. It was administered on these little tablets here. It's about a 10-inch tablet that I procured for this experiment that patients filled out during their clinical appointments. Pre-testing suggested it would take about 10 to 20 minutes for them to complete, and these were completed in the myeloma clinics at the Segment Cancer Center. Participants who agreed to participate did receive $10 in remuneration. Number one, just we try to do that as a thank you for their time, but secondly, to try to increase minority participation, which again has been a challenge in studies like this. Ethical consideration, so I did have scientific and regulatory oversight, so the PRMC at Segment Cancer Center and then the IRB at WashU both reviewed and approved the study, and all patients signed an informed consent document before they participated in the study. The sampling, this was a convenient sample. The plan was 100 to 150 patients with myeloma who are at least 18 years old. Now, myeloma, the average age is over 70. Very rare to be less than 18 anyway, but we always just do that just in case. I did find a 4-year-old with myeloma in the SEER database one year, or one time when I did a review, but very, very rare in younger people. Able to read and understand English because that's what the survey was conducted in, and willing to provide informed consent. Now, patients were recruited from our myeloma clinics at WashU at the downtown location. We do have satellite sites at different facilities, but due to just, so most myeloma patients do come to the downtown location, and just availability of resources, it was all conducted at that site. And then we did hope to enroll 30 to 50 people identified as a minority race for subgroup analysis. So 30 is, for DCEs, as we'll discuss here in a moment, sample size are never an exact science. You can't really calculate sample sizes, but rule of thumb is for a subgroup analysis, you want at least 30 people in that subgroup for you to feel confident in those results. So that was, the goal was at least 30, but up to 50 people identifying as minority race. So talk about the constructs. There's really 4 big constructs that this study was considered with. So first, race ethnicity. This was self-reported by people, and people were dichotomized as either non-Hispanic white or another race. Another socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is not as cut and dry as race. People don't really self-classify themselves. We think of this as a hierarchical ranking based on desirable traits. Probably most people consider themselves middle class, although by definition that's impossible because it means a proportion have to be lower and a proportion have to be higher. But it's like 90% of people in the U.S. consider themselves middle class. So usually we use a lot of proxies for socioeconomic status in research such as this. Some common ones are college degree, which is what I use here. So whether or not somebody had a college degree was dichotomized as a proxy for socioeconomic status. Other proxies like income don't necessarily work for a population like multiple myeloma because most of these patients are older and retired anyway. And their wealth that they've grown over their life is really more their socioeconomic status than what they're bringing in at the time. But then how do you measure wealth by household and stuff? So it gets really challenging. So it's college education I found to be a fairly suitable proxy, and other people has as well. And then secondly, because again it's not a great proxy, I also use neighborhood socioeconomic status. So neighborhood socioeconomic status is more about your surroundings and how the area you live in might contribute to your health. This can be measured in a number of different ways, but it has been shown to contribute to health beyond even what your own socioeconomic status does. So if you live in a poor area, you're more likely to have poorer health than somebody who lives in a more affluent area. And that could be due to pollution, it could be due to other environmental factors, it could be correlational, but it's been shown to be a surrogate for socioeconomic status. So I use the median household income from home census tract as a proxy for this. Now there's many different ways to try to estimate neighborhood socioeconomic status. Census tract is the lowest group you can get where you can actually get income data. So block group is a smaller area, so it would be it's more like a couple hundred people versus census tract is a couple thousand people who live in the area. The problem with block group is you can only get that level of data in the census, and the census stopped asking people income 2 decades ago. And it really came down to people don't like answering questions about their income. So after the 2000 census, they realized that people were declining to do the census just because they didn't want to answer the income. So they got rid of it. 2010 and 2020, no longer asked somebody's income. So The only way you can get household income is through the American Community Survey, and you can only get that at the census tract level. And that's because since they're doing sampling, they can't do a block level because there's just not enough people in a block who are surveyed each year for that estimate to be reliable. So census tract, unfortunately, it is a couple thousand people, but I've shown this to be a good proxy, and I've done many studies that have used this variable and shown that it predicts outcome in cancer and specifically in myeloma. So I felt that was a decent proxy, although obviously it has its limitation. Financial toxicity, there actually is a kind of a gold standard instrument for this. This was developed back in 2017. It's called the Comprehensive Score for Financial Toxicity, or COST. I'm sure somebody came up with the acronym before they actually figured out what to call it, which is tends to be what we do a lot of times in medicine, is we figure out the acronym and then we figure out how to make that actually work. So the COST score is a 11-question measure where patients use a Likert scale, which is coded from 0 to 4. Sometimes they're allowed to do a no answer. We did not allow that in this study. We forced patients to answer all the questions, not by gunpoint or coercion or anything, but the way the survey was built on the tablet, they couldn't advance to the next question until they completed all the questions. This here is from an older study I did using the survey, where not only did the patient complete, they gave us some interesting comments and feedback. Says, I can't afford $23,000 a month for Pomalyst, which is the drug he was taking for his myeloma, and I feel we have been ripped off by Bristol Myers Squibb, who is the maker of said drug. So I just like to include that because it's an eye catcher. And then what we did is we calculated a score as suggested by the COST instrument, and we dichotomized people as greater than or equal to 28 or less than 28. Now there is no gold standard for scoring. Again, it's a continuous score that goes from 0 to 44. The lower the level, the worse the financial toxicity. So 0 is really bad, 44 is really good. But there's no set standards. Some people have suggested like 26. Another study suggested 17.5 is a good cut point for the patients in the lowest quintile, but again, no standard. The reason we use 28 is in my prior study using the COST in myeloma, this was the median at our site, so we just want to divide people into higher and lower, a lot for just sample size estimates and stuff. And, but yeah, this was based on our prior work in this arena. Price sensitivity is much harder to define than the other constructs, even socioeconomic status, because we talk about it in the terms of healthcare as people being non-adherent or patients declining treatment, but we don't really have a formal way of defining it. But in general, it's making these trade-offs, selecting a treatment option that doesn't align with their goals and beliefs, because again, cost implications. So the idea here is that that if cost was not an issue, patients would make one decision, but since cost is an issue, they make an alternative decision. And again, that could be that they're not filling their script, they're picking a different treatment, whatever it may be. But there's no real gold standard way of measuring it. Again, we discussed that before, but I use 3 experimental designs. So first a discrete choice experiment, and then fixed choice task, and then willingness to pay experiment. And the idea was kind of to triangulate using these 3 instruments, since there is no gold standard, that if I were to find similar results across the methods, it would be more support for what I was actually observing here. So I'm going to explain each of those in a little more detail. So first off, a discrete choice experiment, again, is patients being given hypothetical treatment scenarios, usually about 10, but most studies use somewhere between 6 and 12 of these treatment scenarios. And then based on the treatment selections, you used statistical modeling to determine which of these are the most important correlation between the different attributes that are included. And it's really hard to tell what is actually contributing to choice. And for this study, I really wanted precise estimates because I'm not really interested in what patients prefer. I don't really care for my purposes that they want 12 months versus 6 months. I know everybody wants 12 months versus 6 months. The purpose of this study is really to see how different factors like financial toxicity, race, and socioeconomic status are related to these preferences. And for that, you need really tight estimates. Because a lot of times when we do these studies, we either can't do subgroup analysis, because number one, there just might not be enough of a population to do that, or we can, but because of the way the study was designed, the confidence intervals are just so wide around the estimate that you're not going to find any significant interactions when you look for them, unless there are just very monumental differences. So the idea here was a very simple DCE design to get very tight estimates, so that way I can do these complex interactions and really study the phenomena I'm interested in, and not necessarily preferences, which is what these are usually used for. So there was it does say 11 questions, but there's only 8 DCE questions that actually count and contribute to that. There was also 3 fixed choice questions that were embedded in. So question 4, 8, and 11. What I did here is these were basically, so each of these were laid out where 2 of the attributes were exactly the same. So for example, these were both mild side effects in pills. But one of them would have the superior other, like this one had 12 months PFS versus 6 months, and then this one had $100 versus $25. And the way these were set up is the more preferable would always be the higher cost. So what we were forcing people to do here is to directly compare that attribute to that higher cost. So somebody would have to look at this, because these would be non-contributory. They would have to say, is an extra 6 months of PFS worth an extra $75 a month to me? Is getting mild side effects versus moderate side effects worth an extra $75 a month for me? Is getting a pill versus an injection worth an extra $75 a month? So this is another way to ask the same question, but to force patients to think specifically on each attribute. And these, because these were not part of the experimental design of the DCE, the data here does not contribute to the modeling of the DCE, but is analyzed separately as a distinct measure. The third way I aimed to measure price sensitivity was with a bidding game. So bidding game is another one of these economic experiments where patients essentially are asked a question, and they ask, would you pay a certain amount for that? And if they say yes, then you ask, will you pay more? And if they say yes, you ask, they pay more, until basically they say no. So it's a way of incrementally determining how much somebody is willing to pay. Versus, another way of doing this is just asking, how much would you be willing to pay? Number one, you lead yourself to have very right-skewed data, because you'll get $1 billion or something. But also, doing that, it doesn't give a patient any kind of context. So somebody might say $1 or $10. So this gives them context. Would you pay this certain amount? And then you can kind of fine tune it for each patient. So patients were given 2 scenarios. So which matches, the first of which matches our other experimental designs. So patients were told that a new drug comes out that will increase the time it takes for their myeloma to come back approximately 6 months. So instead of 6 months, it would take 12 months. So again, very similar to the 6 or 12 month question I just showed using the fixed choice. But this, instead of asking, would you pay, essentially, would you pay 100 instead of 25, it's actually fine tuning how much would you pay. and asked, would you pay 25? And if they said yes, it asked 50, 100, 200, 400 until they either said no or they reached 800 was the maximum theoretical that we could pay. We would have let somebody say they would pay. That equals out to about $10,000 a year, which was kind of at the end of our reality of what patients would be able to pay. And then we didn't look at anything less than 25 a month because costs that small might not be really meaningful. Right. For the analysis, the primary endpoint was actually the 3 fixed choice questions, and I did that a lot because of sample size considerations. Again, DCE's willingness to pay experience, there's no real way to do a sample size because you don't know how people are going to respond until you actually do the survey. So it really makes that challenging, and generally what the rules of thumbs are usually somewhere between 100 and 300 people for a DCE or willing to pay exercise, and then about 30 for each subset that you want to analyze. But this allowed me to actually look at specific power and sample size calculations by using this as the primary endpoint. And so we compared this using Fisher exact tests. And with a plain sample of about 100 participants, I estimated I'd be able to tell the effect size about 0.5 to 1 Cohen each, with 80% power at 0.05 alpha. So again, this is just one of my many measures, but it's what the study was powered to detect. Interim analysis. So importantly, because I've never used this exact survey before, I didn't know how it would actually interact. So when I created the different levels and designed the DCE and the different experiments, I used the data that I had obtained from my prior work in a similar study, a DCE in myeloma, but also what was out there in the literature, and what patients would theoretically pay. And that was a big consideration, is $25 and $100. Why that? And the truth, to be honest, based on the data and what patients actually pay, that seemed to make sense. But so data suggests that about 85% of patients with myeloma pay less than $50 a month for the drug, even though the treatments cost thousands and thousands of dollars a month because of copay assistance programs, insurance, things like that. 85% pay less than $50 a month, but 10% pay more than $500 a month. So obviously, the considerations here was, well, if I made the prices or the price gap in prices too large, going from $100 to $1,000, what does $1,000 a month mean to somebody who is barely getting by? Like, they can't really answer that question. Like, if somebody asked me, would you pay $1,000 a month? I can actually think about that question. Fortunately, most people in the room here probably, you might not want to, but you actually could make that question. If you're asking somebody who's making minimum wage and barely getting by, would you pay $1,000 a month? There's no context for how they're going to answer the question. So that's why I went with the 25 and 100, because it was within the scopes of what people do pay and will pay, but may make people make the trade-offs. But I did build an interim analysis where after 20 patients, I was going to look and see what the responses were. Not doing any statistics, but just look at the fixed choice questions and see that people are actually patients are price sensitive at those levels. So patients are making trade-offs based on an increase from 25 to 100, which is a big question. It was a big if. So just to jump in, and I'll jump into that first, but and then sensitivity analysis, the DCE, I calculated preference weights as previously described, and then for willing to pay game, I used the Meehan-Whitney test and also created multinomial regression models. But those were how those were analyzed. And then secondary endpoints, again, I wanted to look at financial toxicity and price sensitivity based on race and SES, and I used the Fisher exact test for those. And then exploratory endpoints, I did multivariable models of financial toxicity and price sensitivity, including different covariates of interest. Right, we'll jump into the results. So interim analysis, this was my first big test. So this was like a week in, so it took us 1 week to get 20 patients to complete the survey. And then this is the data that they filled out. So the X's imply that a patient was price sensitive. So they chose the medicine that was associated with the lower cost, but also the less favorable of that attribute. And as we can see here, 80% were price sensitive, which is right at the end of my bounds. So my a priori stopping rules were at less than 20% or greater than 80%. So I still had to think about this of whether or not I thought this was a good, good levels to move forward. But we did see very good variation. What I didn't want to see is like one of these to just be no, or one of them to be yes, because it just might mean that that attribute is not really similar in utility. So for example, if everyone said side effects was yes here, it might mean, well, my side effect levels weren't right. Maybe I need to change those so that way patients are actually having to think about it. But this data does show that people were thinking about it, and we had variation where, some patients said, PFS but nothing else. Side effects but nothing else, and there was a lot of variation, and I felt comfortable moving forward with this, even though it was at the top of my bounds for my stopping rules. So the full enrollment window was 4 weeks from the end of end of March to the end of April of this year. And this is a breakdown of patients that came in our site. Now I say 4 weeks. 90% of these patients actually came in over 8 days. And it's because our myeloma clinics, largely speaking, are on Tuesdays and Fridays. And then there'll be a smattering, like one patient will come in on Monday or something if they're not feeling well, but largely speaking, Tuesdays and Fridays. So really 8 days, pretty much 258 patients came in. I was able to approach 156 of those patients to participate. Now, I did not approach 102. Now, we were limited just based on constraints. It was myself and then one research assistant trying to consent and enroll all these patients, but also I only had 3 tablets. So there was many times where 3 patients were filling out the survey and I had a 4th person who probably would have done it, but I had to wait for them to complete before I could get the next person. And I wasn't going to make people wait around just for that. So that was, led to why some of these patients were not approached. We did try to oversample minority patients. How that worked in practice was if I had 3 tablets and there were people there and one was a minority patient, because those are a subset of our population, I would prioritize that patient over a patient who identified as non-Hispanic white, to try to do that. What we saw was that 134 did provide consent, and 22 patients declined. I did have more African Americans decline than I did white people. And I guess to give a breakdown of this 258, 77% of these people were white, 22% were African American, and then there were 2 people who identified as race other than that. And that was one question earlier when I proposed was, looking at African American versus white. And that's actually what we wound up doing, because I didn't want to limit it to just those 2 races, because since we were offering remuneration, I wanted every patient to be eligible. But the patients who identify as a race other than white or African American or black is less than 1%. So there was only 2 who came in. Of those, we asked one to do the survey, and he said no. So it wound up only being African American or black and non-Hispanic whites actually participating in the study here. But we did have a higher rate of decline among African American, but since we oversampled that cohort, we actually wind up with similar proportions. So they made up about 22% of the entire population. They made up 23% of our actual study set. So while obviously the people who declined probably have different opinions than the people who said yes. And we'll discuss that in limitations. This was a fairly representative population of the patients that we saw come in. Of note, of the patients who provided consent, 4 of them withdrew. A couple of them just put the tablet down halfway and walked off and never told us. We found it in the room halfway done. And then a couple of patients are just like, I'm tired of this. The survey, median time took about 16 minutes. Interquartile range, about 12 to 23 minutes. The minimum, that guy or gal, 5 minutes. I don't know how they got through it that fast, but they did. Maximum was 73 minutes. Now, that might be a little misleading because we told people to take breaks when they needed to. So this person very well might have taken a break while they saw their doctor or something and came back and completed the survey after that. The survey was built, it didn't time out on them. And we did that purposely, so that way these patients were doing these surveys during their doctor's visits, during their treatments. If a nurse came up to stick them and to draw blood, we didn't want them to feel like they had to keep filling out the survey while that was happening. So they were encouraged anytime that was to occur to put the survey down, come back to it once things had settled down. Just looking at my descriptives very briefly, again, about 24% were African American. 70% were white. We had average age was 65, which is similar to what we expect in a myeloma population, especially at Siteman, who tends to be younger. About 50-50 male to female, or 50-50 male-female. We would expect more males in the myeloma population. Myeloma is about 60% males, so that might be slightly skewed versus the population. 58% had a college degree. I was able to calculate neighborhood socioeconomic status on 124. Believe it or not, some people nowadays still have P.O. boxes, which makes this difficult. And then also rural routes and county highways. The software never wants to triangulate those patients. But those were split again at the median, so that's why we have half and half. About half the patients were newly diagnosed, which means they were still in their first line of treatment, while 52% were relapsed refractory, so again, about half and half. When looking at the distribution of the cost score, our median on this one was actually 27 versus 28 in the prior study. The mean was 25.6, so slightly left skewed. When we divided people based on this 28 or higher versus 28 or lower, 54% of the population, 70 of the 130, fell into our higher financial toxicity group. So very similar proportion that we suspected based on our prior study. Now again, the median was a little lower, and that likely was due to us oversampling African Americans in this study versus my prior study had very few African Americans. Looking at bivariate results, comparing the patients who have lower financial toxicity versus higher financial toxicity. Again, higher is bad in this case. It means you had a lower score. So just to make sure that's clear, there were some notable differences. So first off, race. So looking at our, so African Americans comprise 35% of the higher financial toxicity group versus only 12% of the lower financial toxicity group. If we look by neighborhood socioeconomic status, 64% of the lower have higher financial toxicity, which is what we suspect. I did not see a relationship with education, which I did see in my prior study. Marital status, which is another proxy commonly used for socioeconomic status, was different. Patients who were not married were more likely to be in the higher financial toxicity group. Medicaid, strikingly, and kind of a proof of principle, face validity check. All 11 patients who were on Medicaid were in the higher financial toxicity group, showing that this, probably is at least fairly sensitive, because we would definitely suspect that those patients would be. And then disease setting, I observed that 61% of the higher financial toxicity group were relapse or refractory versus only Moving on. Looking at that race is associated with a higher risk of, or higher odds ratio of being in the higher financial toxicity group. So about 3 times more likely to be in that group. Again, we didn't see a relationship with college degree, but we did see one with lower neighborhood socioeconomic status, and again with marital status and disease setting. When you control for education and neighborhood socioeconomic status, we still see that race is associated. But if you control for Medicaid, so this here model, so I couldn't really control for Medicaid because it's an unstable model, because all 11 patients who were on Medicaid had higher financial toxicity, and all 11 were also African American or Black. So what I did here is I just excluded them. We see that excluding them, there is no significant relationship between race and financial toxicity status. Or if you control for marital status, again, another proxy commonly used for socioeconomic status, we see no significant association. So in a nutshell, we see that race seems to be associated with financial toxicity, but that seems to be mediated by socioeconomic status. For the primary endpoint, again, these are these fixed choice tasks that patients made. First, I just looked at descriptively the different kind of patterns, which were very interesting. So what we see is the most willing, the attribute patients were most willing to trade off was the mode of administration. 55% were willing to trade that off versus 49% of side effects, and only 23% for progression-free survival. But there was many different combinations that patients made, where some patients would only trade off progression-free survival. So 6 patients, that's all they would trade off, versus 18 patients would only trade mode of administration. So this was just a very interesting to me that how it shows how treatment preferences can be personalized by each patient. And then importantly, 30% did not exhibit price sensitivity at all. So they said they chose the treatment option that was associated with the more favorable, and not the one with the lower cost. Looking at this as the primary analysis with the Fisher-Exact, we do see that financial toxicity. Just looking at any, so when they make any trade-off, there was no difference. And that was the same for race, college degree, or neighborhood socioeconomic status. And we see that same thing with side effects or administration. So patients seem to be as willing to trade these off, regardless of any of these status. The only thing we saw that was different was in progression-free survival. So we found that patients who were in the higher financial toxicity group, 33% of them said they were willing to trade off PFS, compared to only 12% of the patients in the lower financial toxicity group. Looking at college degree, we found that patients without a college degree, 33% of them said they were willing to trade off progression-free survival, compared to 16% of people with college degree. So again, so although this is our primary endpoint, I kind of picked that, as a whim. I didn't know what proportions people were going to do. So, but looking at this as a breakdown, the reason it seems that these were not different is because these other 2 attributes, there were no difference observed. So I did a multivariable model to look at whether or not race or college education were independently associated with price sensitivity. So again, here's the univariable results versus the multivariable, where I first just controlled for race, and you can see that it mediates the relationship slightly, and then when you further control for education, really no change. So it seems that this association between financial toxicity and price sensitivity was independent of both race and socioeconomic status. And importantly, that there is no relationship between these 2 with price sensitivity when controlling for financial The second thing I'll show is the data from the discrete choice experiment. So just first off showing this, I don't know why that's there, why that's an animation, but so again, the attributes here in the different levels. So one way to do this is just looking at the proportion of times this was selected. So one thing with DCEs is they're actually very efficient at designs because each patient is in the data multiple times. So there was 130 participants, but they each answered 8 questions. So it wound up being 1,040 actual observations in the data. There's 1,040 choices made. So you can just look at the differences. So the 12-month attribute was selected 83% of the time compared to 17% for the 6-month. You can see that is noticeably different than all the rest, which linger right around 50%. And then these contribute to how the beta scores are. So these beta scores are adjusted for the others, so it's not 100%. But if these were 50% and 50%, the beta score would be 0, effectively. It means this has no impact on it, but since we see these variations, that's how the beta scores are all calculated. All right, so this is looking at the data broken up by the different subgroups. So these are preferences for example, here is lower financial toxicity versus higher financial toxicity. And the first thing I'll point out is when looking at differences between based on financial toxicity, race, or socioeconomic status proxies, they're all different. So each of these subgroups are statistically different than the other. And what that means is the importance of cost here. So each of these groups value cost differently. And we can tell by the beta attributes how that is. So for example, those with lower financial toxicity, they value cost less than half as much as those with higher financial toxicity. So it was twice, said another way, cost was twice as important to people with high financial toxicity than it was to people with low financial toxicity, which is what we would potentially expect. And we see that between all groups. African Americans, cost was more important than white people. Those without a college degree, cost was more important than people with a college degree, and for people with lower socioeconomic status, lower neighborhood socioeconomic status, prioritize cost more than people with higher. And then there's a lot of interesting data here. Now one thing to be mindful of the beta coefficients is they're all in relation to each other. So anytime you see differences here, you, by proxy, are going to see a difference in one of the other attributes or other attributes, because priorities are all based off trade-offs here. So you can't just prioritize everything. And that's one of the strengths of DCEs like this, is patients just can't value everything. They're having to choose, do they value this more than that? So what we can see, like for financial toxicity, for example, that most of this was borne out in the PFS. So the beta coefficients for mode were very similar. There was some difference in side effects, but then there was a pretty large difference in how they valued PFS, which supports the prior studies as well. There's many interesting things which I'm already way over time where I want to be, so I can't go into detail. But for example, mode of administration seems to not be very important to anybody other than African Americans or blacks. So they seem to value an oral drug more than any of the other subgroups. So like I said, it's a very interesting way. We can spend all day looking at hypothesizing at these differences. But in a nutshell, all of these subgroups are different in how they prioritize cost, and a lot of that seems to be related to differences in PFS. That's where that's coming from, is they're willing to trade off that PFS. So what I did here is I wanted to actually look at these different interactions and include them in a model of all the interactions. So this is, again, the choice data here, and looking at the interaction between how somebody values cost and whether or not they have higher financial toxicity, whether or not they're African American or black, whether or not they have a college education, and what their level of neighborhood socioeconomic status is. And remind you that they're all statistically significant in univariable models, which is I just showed, but when you include them all together, the only thing that remains is financial toxicity. So it really suggests that the link with price sensitivity here is financial toxicity, and while all these seem to be linked as well, it's by way of financial toxicity. All right, the last experiment was about willingness to pay bidding gain. Again, just remind you, this is how patients filled that out. And just looking at the proportion of patients that are willing to pay, for example, the $800 a month for the 6-month advantage and progression-free survival, about 12% said they would pay that. 5% said they wouldn't even pay $25. When you look at 1 month advantage, which again, I had them do 2, because I wanted to look at potentially smaller advantages. We see that 20% won't pay anything, but 8% would pay $800 a month. So, which is actually kind of confusing because a smaller amount, or well, I mean, as we suspect, a smaller amount of people was willing to pay for a smaller gain than a larger gain. So just go to proof of principle that people value different gains disproportionately or proportionally. So this is looking at the data based on financial toxicity. So looking at the 6 months and then also the 1 month gain. So in both patients who were in the lower financial toxicity group, again, that's where you want to be, were willing to pay more than people in the higher financial toxicity. For the 6 month, that was 200 was the median compared to 100. And for the 1 month, it was 100 compared to 50. So in each experiment, patients with higher levels of financial toxicity were willing to pay half of what somebody with lower levels of financial toxicity would. I did univariable and multivariable models of both. This is of the 6 month, and then this is the 1 month, just to show those together. And in short, financial toxicity patients were always less likely to report less willingness to pay than somebody with lower levels of financial toxicity. Race was associated in the 6 month, but not the 1 month, although there was still a similar trend there. People with Medicaid were less likely, but not in the multivariate. So again, race and financial toxicity seem to be related to price sensitivity in this experiment here. All right, so just to talk about the survey real fast. So one problem you always have with surveys such as this is, are people actually paying attention? Are they doing the survey? Does the data make sense? Now, what I've shown you so far makes sense. It's kind of what we would expect. But you can build in a lot of consistency checks to try to make sure people are actually paying attention. So like first off, there was one, so one of the DCE questions included patients that, that were for 12 months. That's not the right question. I apologize, it's not the right question there. But so the question this was pertaining to was actually question 10, where it was a 6 month, so it was a drug that was associated with 6 months. It had moderate side effects. It was an injection and cost $100 versus a 12 month that had mild side effects was a pill that cost $25. So it's what we call a dominant choice. So it's basically, why would anybody select that? Well, one person selected that, Mr. Number 75. And when you look at their data though, and figure out, well, were they paying attention? They selected the IV for everyone. And then there was a question that was asked as a warm-up. It says, would you prefer a pill or an IV? And he was one of the only people who selected an IV. So it suggests that this guy wasn't not paying attention, that he really wanted an IV treatment and was willing to accept less PFS, more side effects, and pay more to get it. So showing that this could very well be a rational choice. Another thing we look for is something called redlining, and that's people answering the same for every question in the DCE. So these two people answered A for all 11 DCE or the fixed choice questions that were in a line here. And so for this, now most of the favorable ones were A. And if you look at their data in the warm-up questions, and then also in the subsequent parts of the survey, there was variation there. So why somebody would just hit A for all those, but then actually be mindful about filling out their race and everything correctly, which we did compare. We compared their race that we had in their medical chart versus what they said their stated race was. And so they filled everything else out right, it looks like. So why they would just answer all these to A, but it could be. But there was only 2 of those, and would largely not affect the findings. We also look for speeding. So again, I told you one person completed the survey in 5 minutes. So the average person took about 5 minutes just on the DCE portion itself, so the 11 questions. But there were some patients, the shortest was 2 minutes. So I looked at everyone who completed less than 3 minutes. It was about 25 people completed that section, and there was no difference in their preferences, suggesting that some people just went through it quicker. What you would maybe see is if people were just going through it super fast, you would see differences in their preferences versus the rest of the cohort, and we didn't observe that. 2 last checks I did. Again, patients had to ask some questions just in the warm-up. So patients were given this here just as to compare, to show them what a DCE question was going to look like, where they were given an example where they were choosing between 1 year, 2 year, and mild to moderate side effects. And obviously here, this is a patient who wants greater PFS. This is a patient who wants who's more toxicity or side effect avoiding, is what I called it. And I looked at this, and if you look at the patients who are side effect avoiding, the people who selected this, you can see that they prioritize toxicity much higher. So again, their stated preference matched what we saw in the DCE data. So again, just furthering support that people were actually filling this out seriously. And then lastly, again, the injection. So we look at the people who reported that they prefer an injection. We can see that that is much more important to them than it is to the average person. So again, these small subsets are really not there to provide additional data or insight, but just provide additional validity to the results. That people seemed like they were filling this out and actually cared, and not just wanted a $10 gift card to Walmart.
I'm dealing with this right now. I'm individually validating, and it's on a survey, and it is such a headache. Yeah.
It is. Okay, so I've given you a lot of data, and I've talked a long time. What does this all mean? I found a lot of interesting things. I think I'm going to have a few very good papers out of this experience here. Most notably, I think this study does is help provide a new conceptual model for disparities in multiple myeloma. So again, this is what we currently believe to be the conceptual model, that patients who are of a minority race and in lower socioeconomic status are more likely to have these access disparities, and then that at the population turns into outcome disparities. But this is what I think my data supports, and I'll break down here in just a moment, is that the association between race and socioeconomic status seems to largely be mediated by financial toxicity. That it's not just the fact that you're poor, I mean, to be blunt, it's the fact that, well, you're poor and then you can't pay the bills that are coming in, and now you're stressed and you're trying to figure out what the hell to do. If you're poor, you're lower in the socioeconomic spectrum, and you're not getting bills that you can't pay, then why does it matter that you're poor? It really seems to be, again, that the financial toxicity is most of that mechanism. Now, I still have a direct line between socioeconomic status and access disparity, because it has to be acknowledged that people without health insurance, without any means of pay and stuff, they don't even get into the system largely. So since they don't get in the system, they don't come see providers, there's no way for them to even develop financial toxicity. They just don't get the treatments and therefore have worse outcomes. So I'm going to break this down and some of the support we have. So focusing first on this relationship. Now, as discussed, really trying to detangle the effects of race and socioeconomic status is always very difficult, and it's been even in the prior conceptual model, because there is just so much culinarity between the two. But African Americans are more likely to have financial toxicity, but when you control for things like Medicaid, things like college degree, neighborhood socioeconomic status, those seem to be completely, if not, seem to be mediated. There's another study done back in 2015 that found similar results. They found, so in my study I found that African American or black people were about 3 times more likely to have financial toxicity without controlling for socioeconomic status. And they found almost the exact same thing. And when they controlled for marital status and income, again, there was no direct relationship between race and financial toxicity, much like I saw here. So when I controlled for those variables, there was no direct relationship. Now, I don't discount that there might be, which is why I still include that as part of the model, but it seems to be largely mediated by the socioeconomic status. Now, there's been a lot of data out there trying to predict who's going to get financial toxicity, and to be honest, it's just very inconclusive. So there's within the past month, a systematic review of 18 studies of financial toxicity in hematologic malignancies like myeloma was performed. Only 1 of 18 found race to be an independent factor. It was 8 of 18 found socioeconomic status, defined as college education in 2 and marital status in 3 and all kinds of different things to be related. So again, more support for that. But we see all these like one-off things where the most contributory or the most associated risk factor is age. So 10 studies of the 18 found that age was associated with financial toxicity, which I didn't observe here and I didn't observe in my other study. And even of the 10 that they found, 7 said younger was worse, 3 said older was worse. And the same thing, like in this study, I found that relapse refractory disease might be more likely to have financial toxicity than somebody who's newly diagnosed. I didn't find that in my last study, which was 129 patients compared to 130. Everything was defined exactly the same, and the only difference there was I had less minority patients. And they were done at the same site, so theoretically the same population filled it out, and I found very discrepant results. And it's very unclear why, there's been so much effort, largely the effort to date regarding research on financial toxicity is predicting who gets it. And it seems actually kind of faulty. And part of that is because I actually just reanalyzed my data from my study a year ago. So that study aimed at looking at predictors of financial toxicity, which I found few. But I also did a longitudinal design where patients were asked over a 9-month period to fill out surveys again. And what I found is about 1/3 of the population have wide changes in what their financial toxicity is, at least by the cost score, over this just short time period. Where in the patterns you see some patients go up, a lot of patients go down, some rebound, and it's a whole lot of mess. And when studies like mine, and most of the others, we use a dichotomous thing to determine if somebody has financial toxicity, whether or not I surveyed this person here or there might change how they were dichotomized. And same thing if I were to use this as linear, this seems to be a dynamic process that trying to predict who is going to have financial toxicity at some random point of time in their cancer journey doesn't seem like it's probably the best way to do it. And in reality, I think this data helps support, and along with the data showing that prediction just hasn't worked very well, that we need to move away from trying to predict who gets it, and instead try to better identify when it happens, and interventions to prevent the non-adherence and other things that can come out. So, like I said, I think this helps explain why there's just so much inconsistency in data regarding financial toxicity prediction. So having established that, again, so although I said predicting this seems faulty, I still would suggest that the data seems to support that there is this link here. Now, how that is used in practice, if you can't really predict it, is a different question. But what I was able to show here is this financial toxicity is associated with price sensitivity. And this was true in all three ways I left. So if you look at like willing to pay estimates based on the DCE, people who have lower levels of financial toxicity were willing to pay 4 times more for PFS advantages than somebody with higher levels. When you look at the DCE, they prioritized it, or I'm sorry, the fixed choice question, they were 4 times more likely to maybe select the inferior treatment. If you look at the willing to pay data, they were willing to pay half as much. So although there might be differences in degree, they all showed pretty much the same thing. That patients with higher financial toxicity do exhibit more price sensitivity. Now, where I can't add with this study is how this would ultimately lead to access disparities or outcome disparities. It is plausible that if somebody is more concerned with cost and more concerned, in using that in their treatment decision making, that would in turn lead to differences in access if it was more consolidated within certain groups, such as African Americans, and how that would ultimately lead to outcome disparity. So like I said, I wasn't able to address this, but it is plausible that this could lead to this. And there are studies that have shown, not like mine, where it's used treatment choice, but looked at non-adherence. So there are many studies that directly show that the higher you charge a person for, so there's a drug class for chronic myeloid leukemia, which has fundamentally cured most patients, but it's very expensive. And you can, it's very clearly been demonstrated, the cost a person pays per month shows how adherent they are to that medication. So, supporting this, that people are more cost conscious, make those trade-offs, and therefore would have potentially worse outcomes. Secondly, this study looked at patient preferences, and while that wasn't a big focus here, it is supported and similar to some of the prior studies. So I showed here what the importance of PFS versus cost versus the other attributes compared to a recent meta-analysis of DCEs in healthcare. So in my study, about 58% of preference was based on PFS. In all studies, it was 37%. In my study, it was 22% was accounted for by cost. In other studies, it was 33%. So again, some differences, but within the realm of similarity. But it's important to point out that, largely speaking, these are kind of meaningless, because you can make a DCE show whatever you want it to by balancing the designs. So this study really tried to focus on making patients make trade-offs. So we looked at making the attributes and the levels similar in utility versus, and that definitely can play a role. For example, there's been 3 DCEs in myeloma published in the past couple of years, one of which is the study I conducted and showed a slide from earlier. So 2 of those studies, not the one I did, showed that PFS was like 80% of preference. And in my study, it was much more modest. Well, their study used overall survival, and it ranged from either 1 to 5 years or 1 to 9 years, versus the study I conducted was 6 months to 24 months. So in reality, comparing these across studies doesn't really make sense because you can kind of balance these however you want. But it's just showing that my data seems to at least somewhat match the data that's already out there, and again supporting the validity. Another quick finding is the data suggests from the willing to pay gain that increases in utility for progression-free survival are not maybe not linear. So patients were willing to pay about $100 on average for 6-month improvement of PFS. So standard utility theory would tell us that that's basically $16 a month. So for 1 month they pay 16, they pay 32 or 33 for 2 months, and so on, in a linear thing. But what we found is that patients were actually willing to pay $50 for a 1 month improvement in survival. And then, so this here even assumes linearity, where in reality it could be some kind of version like these red lines here, where utility flatlines into a certain point. We don't really know, but standard utility theory doesn't seem to necessarily apply to things like progression-free survival. Notably, 44% of the study said they would pay the same amount for 1 month as they would for 6 months, suggesting that maybe that patients weren't like looking at it as a value of, value added as we would think with standard utility theory, that it's, I would pay X number of dollars, or I can pay X number of dollars to improve my outcome, and I will pay that regardless of what the improvement is. So if the improvement is 6 months or 1 month, I can only pay $50. So that's a new finding and really questions, and it's contradictory to what we think of in standard economic theory, and should be explored more in future research. So strengths of the study. So first off, internal consistency. So all 3 of my measures for price sensitivity and the association with financial toxicity agreed. There was a difference in magnitude in some, but all very similar. And that the DC preference weights match the stated preferences. So again, I did those different consistency checks, and everything matched. What patients said they preferred matched the DCE. So the data looks very clean. That patients were very thoughtful when they completed these surveys, which is not always the case. In addition, the study has high face validity. The direction of the preferences were all consistent. Some things we find in studies like this, especially ones that are kind of underpowered or include a lot of attributes and levels, you get very inconsistent things where a patient, it'll tell us a patient values 6 months more than 12 months, which, I guess is possible, but very unlikely. So because, but the data here all match exactly what we thought. Patients preferred oral drugs, they preferred longer PFS, and so on. So again, establishing face validity of the results. And then additionally, the statistical precision. The reason I was able to do all these fancy interactions was because I had very precise estimates of my preference weights. Versus, other studies, including the ones I've done prior, the one I did prior, where you include a lot more attributes and a lot more levels, you get much less precision, and you're not able to do this. So limitations. So first off, small sample size. 130 patients is fine for a DCE. It meets the rule of thumb between 100 and 300, but larger sample size. 130 people does not represent the hundreds of thousands of people who have myeloma, and especially the patients who come in my center. So this was a convenient sample. Again, people who said no probably have different opinions than people who said yes. People who come to the Second Cancer Center are probably different than people who don't. So that obviously a limitation. And then, but the biggest one is external validity. And just to be blunt, there is no way we should make conjecture of what somebody did on this survey has any bearing on what the hell they would do in the real world. It just, I mean, the surveys, don't bear the same consequences as making real decisions. They don't have the same emotional impact. Studies have shown that on simple behavior they can be rather predictive, but only if the choices actually mirror what they have in the real world, which I designed my survey to not mirror the real world. For example, I used 6 and 12 months to try to get a utility that would make sense that people would make trade-offs of. People today with even the most advanced disease, a drug just recently got approved that offers about 2 years increase in progression-free survival, even for patients furthest along in their disease. So my 6 and 12 months is nothing related. My $25 and $100 in cost, I actually had a very good conversation with one patient who called me after the survey. It's like, I like your survey, I did it, I want to give you some feedback. Who's paying $25 and $100 a month? I pay over $500 and I've got great insurance. It's like, well, he was a very wealthy guy and had the money to pay it. He goes, I love your study. I just wanted to give you the feedback of those costs might not be, and I had to explain to him, well, but if I ask, would you pay $500 or $1,000 to somebody making minimum wage? How can they answer that? And so obviously that's the limitations there. But so that is called hypothetical bias. When people are making decisions, even if the decisions they're making on the survey actually are their preferences, the differences between that and what they would make in the real world is hypothetical bias, and that is very, very possible here. Because the study was not mirrored to do that, it was really just to look at this phenomenon that I wanted to explore. I think there are some implications of this study for practice. So first off, this is a novel use of DCEs in healthcare. Largely, DCEs are atheoretical, and they're designed to elicit patient preference. Most of those don't even do subset analysis. If they do latent class analysis where they're just looking for trends and preferences and not really correlating that to patient subgroups. I recently tried to review studies looking at differences in preferences based on race, and there is almost no literature out there that compares preferences of black people versus white people with cancer in their treatment goals. And again, partly that's because the way these are designed, it doesn't really lend itself to do that. But this study can be used as a way this can be used as an example of a way to study those phenomena and those interactions that we showed occurred here. But more largely, it supports that a possible mechanism for the disparities in myeloma, at least, is financial toxicity. And although this study was specific to myeloma, I believe it likely generalizes to other cancers as well. That, although myeloma patients might be more likely to experience financial toxicity because they're older, because the way treatment is set up and the cost of care, all patients with cancer receive bills, and patients who are having more problems with those bills might be making these same trade-offs. And if it is a mechanism, maybe it can be a target for intervention. Again, interventions to date trying to eliminate or reduce disparities in cancer outcomes have been modest at best. And again, that could be contributed to the fact that we don't really know why these disparities are occurring. So we do assignment is that we do outreach, and we do these outreach things to try to improve outcomes, and but they're largely untargeted. If this is a mechanism, we can work to identify better the patients who are suffering from this and try to eliminate that before it leads to possible disparities. But I always have to note with everything, anything we can do can also always further perpetuate disparities. So even if we start doing this and we can identify people who are getting financial toxicity and we can treat that and improve outcomes, if white people get that more than the rest of the people, it's only going to further perpetuate what we're already seeing. So we always have to be mindful of that. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for sitting and listening to me talk for the past hour and a half. And my colleagues and supporters at WashU, particularly Ravi Vish, who without this I probably would have never went to grad school and my research studies would never have been possible.
So let's start with questions. Anybody has thoughts, comments?
I just have some short ones, really. I thought it was terrific work that you did here. It's very sophisticated and mature and nuanced. And a couple of things, though, my overall thinking is that I think you provide a compelling case for enlarging this to bigger samples and extensions, and so forth. The other thing is a lot depends on this cost measure, right? It's sort of like pretty important, and so it's sort of psychometric properties, and especially as you've shown, relates to its instability over time.
Yes.
And so it strikes me that that's a real important line of research if one is interested in studying financial toxicity, is to have some kind of designs that are, longitudinal but include pretty high frequency repeated measures of financial toxicity with theoretical and empirical timing events that would be associated with it. You know what I'm saying? To really begin to understand it as this living organism of financial toxicity, right? And so, to me, I find, how you've unpacked the SES construct with that, and to make it more sensible, more, I really get tired, frankly, of social science research and medical research always referring to SES. It's boring, it's lazy, it's dull, without kind of going deeper into that and saying, well, okay, what do you really get? What are you getting at there? And so I like that you're saying you would agree with that and say, I'm trying to get at it here of what's going on, right? And so I don't know that much about this cost measure or similar measures, but I do think there is some measurement work to be done, not necessarily by you, or it's not a critique, but that could be fruitful to really getting at that. And so, did you? And I don't remember. My guess is it probably hangs together pretty well. So the Cronbach's alpha coefficient for the internal consistency or reliability of the cost in your data. I don't know if you reported that or not.
I didn't.
Maybe you can just put the alpha equals whatever it was, and it's probably not the case. But you could look at if there's any individual items that are altering the alpha coefficient. Probably not. I would doubt it, because just looking at the wording of them all, they seem like, in terms of on the face of it, that they would be intercorrelated. So, but those are two very 5-minute things that you might want to add to your written dissertation, just to show that they hang together, my thing. But I think I agree with your validity assessments, that the pattern of results support the validity, some of the validity issues here, you know what I mean? And so those are just my global reactions.
Did you report the SES? you split it at the median, you split your sample at the median, what was the median?
You use 28, right?
Well, no,
No,
you
no,
don't
for
use
the
20.
for SES, for
So
the,
so it's
for the
it's
income.
not the individual, it's for
right, it's for the
the
track,
area.
right,
I believe it was like $56,000 was the median household income for, their area.
but you split your sample directly at the median
Correct.
based on all of these different,
Based on the sample median.
okay,
So it's not the median of all possibilities of the sample median.
okay,
Of
Which
the
is what I've
data
done
you
in prior.
collected.
Correct.
Yeah.
So there was 124 patients I was able to access their NES, NSES data from. It was
Right.
the median of them. So I just split them in half.
which was about 56,000.
Correct. Which is, I could compare that to what it is in the population, US population.
I was just curious, that was one thing that I was curious about, and whether, like how you chose that and then, but,
And you use the 28 as your median split on your measure, even though it was actually 27 in the data, but that probably wouldn't matter too much.
Yeah, I
in
used
terms of
28
your-
because that was I wanted to base the results off of my prior
Yeah,
study. And
yeah.
part of that was due to sample size
And it ended up
consideration
being
and stuff.
27 anyway.
Correct. And to be honest, I expected that because my prior study had a similar sample size, but only 10 African Americans, and the assumption was if I oversampled or increased the proportion of African Americans who tend to fall lower SES, then the financial toxicity score median would go down a little bit. But yeah, it was just based on the a priori assumptions.
Did you have missing data to report?
So the only missing data was 6 in SES measured.
Okay,
You know,
all right.
and that is because, so the way the survey was designed, patients were not able to advance. So the 4 patients who were excluded were, done so because of missing data. Because, yeah, they stopped midway through the survey.
Measure subjective distress.
Oh, yeah, so it's, so it's 11 questions, it says in the last 7 days. So in the last 7 days, how much do you agree with these statements? And it's a Likert scale,
Okay.
and, so it's 11 items, some are reverse coded, but, so it's that, yeah, during that moment of time, how do you feel?
So if it's really measuring a subjective state, kind of like, the PHQ questionnaire for depression or a GAD for anxiety, that could fluctuate.
Mhm.
I mean, that could legitimately be people's subjective states are fluctuating.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things that I hope to come out of my qualitative work is, we think, in the charts I can look, did the patient have a medication change? Did they, were they hospitalized for a month? Was something like that. But the financial toxicity score could have nothing to do with their care. It could be that like they're going along and doing very well, and then their car breaks down. And they're paying for their medication fine, but not when they have to pay $2,000 to get their car fixed, and now they're trying to figure out what to do. So now they're having a drastic change that had nothing to do with their care. Or maybe, it's something just like, totally not related. And I'm kind of lost now. But yeah, like I said, that something. I'm sorry. Where I was going with that is, maybe it could be something artificial. And one hypothesis I have is January. For anybody who has health care, especially co-insurance, co-pays, you know that January 1st, all that crap resets. For patients in myeloma who face thousands and thousands of dollars a month, most of them hit their copay or out-of-pocket limit in the first quarter of the year. So if I surveyed them in July, August, September, they're doing fine because they're not getting any bills. I surveyed them in February after they've gotten a $4,000 bill for January. It's a much different scale.
Yeah.
So it could have nothing to do, clinically related, just these artificial things in healthcare billing.
The research really does consistently show that about around deductibles and stuff, with high deductible health plans.
Yeah.
People's price sensitivity, before they've hit the deductible, they're, very price sensitive. But if they have a condition like cancer where they're going to hit it early, then after they hit the deductible and they're out of pocket max, so they're not price sensitive anymore.
Correct.
Because it's,
And you would in turn think that their, financial toxicity has lessened as well, depending how much of those bills are still sitting on them, but.
so this is gonna be a crude way of putting it, but I wanna make sure I understand like financial toxicity and distress about it correctly. If I'm poor and I have a lot of bills and I just don't give a shit and it doesn't bother me, does that mean I'm not gonna be high on financial toxicity? I'm like, I don't care, no big deal.
So so most of them are subjective, and it's really phrased that way because earlier studies related to financial burden really focused on the financial burden part of it. It was just what are the costs, and costs don't mean the same thing to everybody.
Yeah.
Obviously different wealth, but also some people just don't have that much. They don't care as much about the bills. So, but the questions, some of them are very specific. Like, I know I have enough money to pay for my medication. Well,
Okay.
that's more of a discrete thing that they, I don't know how somebody would answer that if they just didn't care. If they knew they didn't have the money, like, yeah, sure. But the cost is really moving it into the subjective realm versus where the decade of research before really focused on the direct cost of care. And part of that is because that work was not very fruitful. It's very easy to say people pay a ton of money. Well, how does that actually impact people? So that the cost measure specifically how it's impacting that
So
person.
could that point at like possible interventions? Like I'm thinking, in normal life, having distress about a lot of unpaid bills is actually like a pretty important healthy mechanism, even though it's causing you distress because it's getting you to, if you need to pick up an extra job, cut back on spending. But maybe once you get this condition that's possibly terminal, those same feelings of distress are no longer healthy for your survival, and we should like put you in exposure and response prevention therapy to like, so that it doesn't bother you anymore. Or something. I don't know. Like,
Yeah, so scores of the cost have been associated with higher lower scores, higher financial toxicity, associated with less quality of life, more prone to non-adherence, and worsened outcomes overall. So and is a potential impact for or point of intervention. For example, there are several studies looking at that as an intervention now. Siteman is doing one I'm actually not involved with, and they're they're providing financial literacy courses to people who are newly diagnosed to hopefully reduce their symptom burden by empowering them to know more about hospital bills and stuff. So there are interventions looking at that right now.
How effective really is that when the problem is you can't buy milk for your family. You know what I mean? It's kind of like it's a problem of lack of resources that ultimately it's beyond just having the knowledge in some cases.
Yeah, and where I think like trying to do something whole cloth to a population, some of which would not even need it potentially, might not be the best route versus I really think working on identifying these patients better. We don't ask this enough in healthcare. Like Siteman, we don't have patients fill out the cost other than in these clinical trials. Patients and anecdotal, but the physicians I talk to say, well, we ask costs usually when they start a treatment, but never again unless the patient brings it up.
Mm-hmm.
Because unless the patient comes out and says, well, I'm having trouble paying for medication, it's just not interested in the clinical encounter. So trying to figure out how best to work it into that clinical encounter and figure out what patients are on that bubble and potentially could be use an intervention, whether or not it's literacy, financial literacy, or here's a stipend, or here's
Exactly,
whatever.
I don't
Yeah.
have $500
Exactly.
to pay for the monthly
Exactly.
cost.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another thing to keep in mind too is the age of the sample with all of this, because I thought that your if I'm not mistaken, the mean age is around
Older.
65.
Yeah.
65, so, and.
That's important to keep in
It is.
mind,
Yeah,
you know,
you're
when
right.
we're thinking about,
Totally.
about these interventions and so forth, and what might fit that age group.
Well, and you
Yeah.
mentioned, when you were talking about age as a factor in the literature, right? And well, the reason you don't have much of a range, right, in your sample?
Well, so we do. So the average is 70, but you know, so 65 was our mean, but I think the standard deviation was like 12 or something.
Okay.
So it was, you know,
But less so comparatively, like these other studies that are showing these connections to age are probably different, have probably a wider range of,
yeah, and they could, but like I said, even the data there is
Yeah.
mixed. Half the
Yeah.
studies show that being younger is worse. Half the studies
Yeah.
older is worse. And a lot of it's again, definitions are always different. Where if you're comparing a cancer that happens between the ages of 20 and 40, yes, being younger is probably worse than being older. If you're looking at a cancer that occurs between 40 and 70,
Right.
being older is probably
Totally.
worse because there's probably a lot of heterogeneity based on the disease. So breast cancer, which affects mostly women in the younger age, and what the study at Siteman is working on, like I said, that would be a swath of people usually between the ages of like 35 and 60.
yeah.
Great job. I think you did a really good job. The only like kind of two minor technical things I'd say to think about when you're submitting papers on this is a lot of researchers are going to ask questions about the data generating process and the sample and who is included and excluded. Do you have any like measures on the excluded people that you weren't able to interview or that declined interviewing?
So I have so I have the demographics of the people who declined and that I did not approach. So that's why I said 22 point some odd percent of the entire population that could have been eligible was African American or Black, and it was like 24% in my study. So I do have all that now. The granular data is
Yeah.
is the cost and all that stuff. I would not be privy to, but demographically speaking, it seemed to be fairly representative.
Yeah, any like kind of basic descriptors that you have on the people that didn't end up answering the survey?
Or just being really
Yeah.
upfront right from
Yeah.
the get-go, just to take that sting away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's broken down actually in the dissertation. So I give a breakdown of the race and of the patients who were approached. I said about 75% of African Americans were approached compared to about, I think it was like 56% of white people, but that was intentional. I do break that down, but just by race, not necessarily by age or anything.
Could you
I can easily do that.
reinitiate data collection and just, I mean, you're doing this, you get your PhD and all this business, but could you reinitiate some data collection to add information about those that aren't participating as to make a future paper, you hold off on publishing, to make the future paper stronger to have these things? I'm just floating an idea. I don't know if that's too feasible or not.
So clinical data, but are you talking like cost scores or?
In other words, like, okay, you hit your marks to defend this dissertation, right? You have this data. It's very interesting. It's good. It's got some limitations, of course. But what if it were convenient to do so, and I don't know that, to start reinitiating more data collection and hold off publishing on what you have now?
I
You know what I mean? And then with the idea of, if I do that, would I then be able to hit a higher echelon journal? By, you know what I'm saying? Because you probably already have a lot of publications, and what if I did that? Because a lot of what you did here, well, was under some time constraints for the practical matter of a dissertation, right? And
Yeah, so I certainly can. Now, what changes though is unless I use the 250 some odd patients as my population, and
Yeah.
my population changes because there's people coming in today who were not here
Missing.
a month ago.
Yeah.
You know, so there
chart
were,
some people though, that 250 some odd people, including the people you didn't approach, do you know who those people are and like,
yes.
can you
Can
access the
you,
charts?
yeah, and then you have a file drawer administrative body of data.
Yeah, I have.
But they don't collect
But
the
they don't-
cost
they don't
score
collect the cost
or the-
score.
Oh, okay.
They're
So
not
that's-
collecting some of the data.
I would have to consent those patients to be able to get a
Or
call.
you'd have to get them to agree to provide it as a normal clinic.
Oh, even to,
procedure.
yeah, get their report on like just their chart variables like there.
Chart variables I can get. I have.
Okay.
I do have them.
I mean, even that, if you're going to a journal, like whatever data you can get on those patients,
Yeah.
it would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Like the administrative data, but yeah, following up with them too, that could be.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that you have a case to be said for identifying who these patients are, right, within the clinic. Like, why are we not collecting the cost data more frequently on all of our patients as part of as part of normal practice, right? And identifying who needs intervention at what points, you know, not that I'm saying you have the power to make that happen, but, right, it seems like there's data that suggests that that's relevant
Mhm.
to their choices and potential intervention support by bringing in social workers or whatever it is at certain points based on their scores.
Yeah, and we've had that discussion that where it gets challenging and said it because I've been part of the care team and been involved with them for years. They're a little more frank sometimes than they would be other. Like one of the challenges when they get new information that they're not sure how to use,
Yeah.
like it actually opens up like questions and then even questions of liability. Because like, what if a patient answers a certain score and it's like we don't know what to do with that, and then the patient like has a meltdown or something. It's like, well, is that something we should have intervened on? Like, so collecting data is not always innocuous in healthcare because like if you're doing a test, you're not responsible for making sure
Respond to it.
that exactly, and if
Yeah.
you don't know how to
Fair enough.
respond.
Yeah.
So yeah, that outside the clinical trial, that's been challenging.